The question occurs on the amendment number 5 by Mr. Duffy. Clerk will call the roll.
Mrs. Maloney.
No.
Mrs. Maloney votes no. Ms. Velasquez. Ms. Velasquez votes no. Mr. Sherman. Mr. Sherman votes no. Mr. Meeks. Mr. Meeks votes no. Mr. Clay. Mr. Clay votes no. Mr. Scott. Mr. Scott votes no. Mr. Green. Mr. Green votes no. Mr. Cleaver. Mr. Cleaver votes no. Mr. Perlmutter. Mr. Perlmutter votes no. Mr. Himes. Mr. Himes votes no. Mr. Foster. Mr. Foster votes no. Mrs. Beatty. Mrs. Beatty votes no. Mr. Heck. Mr. Heck votes no. Mr. Vargas. Mr. Vargas votes no. Mr. Gottheimer. Mr. Gottheimer votes no. Mr. Gonzalez. Mr. Gonzalez votes no. Mr. Lawson. Mr. San Nicolas. Mr. San Nicolas votes no. Ms. Tlaib. Ms. Tlaib votes no. Ms. Porter. Ms. Axney. Ms. Axney votes no. Mr. Caston. Mr. Caston votes no. Ms. Presley. Ms. Presley votes no. Mr. McAdams. Mr. McAdams votes no. Ms. Ocasio-Cortez. Ms. Wexton. Ms. Wexton votes no. Mr. Lynch. Mr. Lynch votes no. Ms. Gabbard. Ms. Gabbard votes no. Ms. Adams.
No.
Ms. Adams votes no. Ms. Dean.
No.
Ms. Dean votes no. Mr. Garcia. Mr. Garcia votes no. Ms. Garcia.
No.
Ms. Garcia votes no. Mr. Phillips. Mr. Phillips votes no. Mr. McHenry. Mr. McHenry votes no. Ms. Wagner. Ms. Wagner votes no. Mr. King. Mr. King votes no. Mr. Lucas. Mr. Lucas votes no. Mr. Posey. Mr. Posey votes no. Mr. Luke DeMeyer. Mr. Luke DeMeyer votes no. Mr. Huizenga. Mr. Huizenga votes no. Mr. Duffy.
No.
Mr. Duffy votes no. Mr. Stivers. Mr. Stivers votes no. Mr. Barr. Mr. Barr votes no. Mr. Tipton. Mr. Tipton votes no. Mr. Williams. Mr. Williams votes no. Mr. Hill. Mr. Hill votes no. Mr. Emmer. Mr. Emmer votes no. Mr. Zeldin. Mr. Zeldin votes no. Mr. Loudermilk. Mr. Loudermilk votes no. Mr. Mooney. Mr. Mooney votes no. Mr. Davidson. Mr. Davidson votes no. Mr. Budd. Mr. Budd votes no. Mr. Kustoff. Mr. Kustoff votes no. Mr. Hollingsworth. Mr. Hollingsworth votes no. Mr. Gonzalez. Mr. Gonzalez votes no. Mr. Rose. Mr. Rose votes no. Mr. Stile. Mr. Stile votes no. Mr. Gooden. Mr. Gooden votes no. Mr. Riggleman. Mr. Riggleman votes no. Madam Chairwoman. The Chairwoman votes no.
Have all members voted? Does any member wish to change his or her vote? If not, the clerk will report.
Madam Chairwoman, on that vote, there are 0 ayes and 57 noes.
A majority having voted against the amendment is not agreed to.